President Lee Jae-myung is poised to make his diplomatic debut in Canada this coming weekend at the Group of Seven gathering, during which separate bilateral summits may also take place with his foreign counterparts. We have more on Press Perspective today. Hello and hope your work week is off to a good start. It's Monday, June 9th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. It's been less than a week since President Lee Jae-myung has entered the top office, and already plans are in the works for his debut on the international stage at the G7 gathering over in Canada this coming Sunday. For more on this, I have Fabian Kretschmer with German news agency DPA here in the studio. Fabian, as always, it's great to have you here.
Thanks.
I also have Steven Borowiec with Japanese weekly news magazine Nikkei Asia with us. Steven, welcome back.
Nice to see you.
Right, Fabian, we will start with you. And before we touch upon President Lee Jae-myung's diplomatic debut, let's start off with a few words regarding the president's victory of the snap election last week. Do you believe the result of the latest presidential election here in South Korea came as no surprise?
Yeah, it was not a surprise. Actually, there was one aspect that in the end did surprise me. I will come to that in a bit. But yeah, if you looked at the survey polls before the election, they all saw Lee Jae-myung in the lead. Actually, a little bit more clearer in the lead than, so in the end, actually the result was slightly more narrow than expected according to some polls. And I mean, my educated guess is that some voters who might have intended to vote for Lee Jae-myung, another conservative candidate, but who had no realistic chance of winning the race, that maybe last minute they changed to give their vote to, change their vote. But I would say if you look at the gender and also the generation divide, that is really very, very stark. So we know that senior citizens, they tend to vote more conservative. And then we know that among middle-aged people, that was really where Lee Jae-myung got his victory. I mean, basically he had 70% of support by people in his 40s and 50s. And then when you look at the young people, and that is the surprising thing, Lee Jae-myung, he had very little support for male voters in his 20s, while actually for female voters the support was very big. And that is really a very, very stark gender and also a generation divide.
Right, it's something that quite a number of pundits have also been making note of. Stephen, we spoke on the eve of the election. We are now speaking with the results out there. There are scholars, Stephen, who claim that the voter support for the DP had very little to do with its candidates' policies and quite a lot to do with punishing the PPP. What have you been hearing on the ground?
I've definitely heard that take, and I think there's a fair bit of merit to it. I think if you looked at the kind of discourse in the lead up to the election, there was not a lot of policy discussion. There was not a lot of candidates going into a lot of detail about what they would do in terms of how they would manage the economy or in terms of how they would manage South Korea's foreign affairs or anything like that. I mean, it was a lot of, I think, kind of character-driven stuff, and I think it would just go back to the old Korean electoral principle of the shimpan, of showing the judgment of the previous administration and not. I mean, I'm from Canada. This tends to be the way that Canadian electoral politics works. That a lot of elections are decided on the basis of not wanting to vote a government in, but wanting to get the current government out. And I think there was some of that. I mean, in some of my pre-election reporting, I initiated some conversations at advanced polls. And I remember I had one voter told me that normally he would vote conservative because he felt like conservatives were kind of more reliable stewards of the economy and more reliable managers of South Korea's relations with the U.S. and relations with North Korea, et cetera. But he said in this election, he said it would probably be the only time in his life that he would vote for the DP. And he said his rationale for this was he wants for the long-term health of the conservative movement in Korea. He said he wanted the conservative movement to get the lesson from this election that they could not do something like martial law, that they kind of had to learn that this was a bridge too far and kind of take this as removing them from power and giving them the chance to get their act back together and do some soul searching and move on from there. I mean, the data that we have about voting patterns, like it doesn't specifically say, people don't really say why they voted. We can only really speculate as to that. But if you looked at the polls in the lead up to the election, what people said specifically was mostly that they wanted a leader who could manage the economy and bring back growth, and who could also kind of heal the divisions in South Korean society, kind of just bring the temperature back down to normal. So now that the vote is over, we'll get to see just how effective the Lee administration is in carrying out those objectives.
Right, we will for sure. On the diplomatic front then, Fabian, the annual NATO summit, it's supposed to take place later this month in the Netherlands. And while South Korea is not, of course, a member of this security alliance, it has been invited to its summit in recent years as an Indo-Pacific partner. In what direction, Fabian, might South Korea's ties with NATO flow under the Lee Jae-myung administration?
I think it might get slightly more complicated, but I don't expect any fundamental change. To give you some context, it was very interesting when Lee Jae-myung, before he got elected, he was asked at a press conference, if elected as president, would he actually take part in this summit? And he answered very cautiously and said, well, if there's some really pressing issues, then yes, but now there's such a turbulent situation in our country, so that's really not my priority. I mean, I'm paraphrasing here. And he was very cautious. And if you look back at what he said in previous years, some statements were quite critical towards NATO. I mean, I remember when the full-blown war in Ukraine broke out, he basically accused Ukrainian President Zelensky of, having provoked Russia, which I think is a rather controversial remark. But on the other hand, actually, he toned down his rhetoric, at least from the NATO perspective, and he became more moderate in his stance. He also made sure already that, South Korea will continue to supply Poland with weapons, which is very crucial from the perspective of NATO. And in the end, I don't expect much to change, but I think President Lee Jae-myung, he wants to, strike a more balance also towards China and maybe be also a little bit more engaging to Russia. We will see. So I think from a NATO perspective, there's some caution here, but in the end, I think Lee Jae-myung will not question his ties to NATO and also his ties to the Western world.
Right. Well, despite the uncertainty with regard to South Korea's participation in the NATO summit later this month in the Netherlands, Steven, President Lee Jae-myung is poised to partake in the G7 gathering in Canada this coming weekend. What does this reality tell you about the Lee Jae-myung administration's foreign policy initiatives, if you will?
Just to tell us anything that's too specific, I think probably what it shows us more than anything is that Lee is just kind of determined to hit the ground running, and if this early in his term, if there's something going on that he feels is significant and is a chance for him to kind of set these key relations in motion, then it makes sense for him to do that. I mean, he I believe it was on Friday, he held a phone conversation with U.S. President Trump, and just earlier today he held a phone conversation with Japanese Prime Minister Ishiba. And so I think that he wants to, as we know, South Korea faces all these kind of pressing economic and security issues. There's the question of tariffs with the U.S., there's the question of North Korea, there's the question of how he will manage relations with the administration of Xi Jinping in China. And so there's lots for him to do, and I feel like it probably was a fairly easy calculation for him to determine that being present in Canada this coming weekend was in his best interest. The bigger question kind of hanging over this is that, I think you alluded to this in your question, Sunhee, is will he have to kind of demonstrate loyalty to one side or another? Will he have to take a side in terms of showing that he's very loyal to the alliance with the U.S., or that he is a little bit cagey about that and he wants to kind of keep a more open channel with China? His predecessor, former President Yoon Suk-yeol, was very clear on that. From the kind of outset of his presidency, he said, we are going along with the U.S., this is our ally, and, come what may, we are going to be very steadily loyal to this, what we feel is the most reliable partner. He was clear that he didn't see China or, the broadening of more multilateral partnerships as ever being a potential replacement for what he already had with the U.S. alliance. Lee is going to have to Certainly, it seems like he's not going to do that, but he's going to have to make some kind of more decisive pledges, I think. Like if you look at his inaugural speech, he just kind of talked a lot about being pragmatic and, acting in the national interest. Like these are all well and good. I mean, there's a kind of like statements that any world leader can make that are basically impossible to criticize. I mean, like who would not act in their national interest? Who never does not want to be pragmatic? But it all kind of raises the possibility that like this is a foreign policy vision that lacks an actual coherent vision. He may be able to pull off this kind of case-by-case pragmatic basis of like, approaching each country in a case-by-case basis and, negotiating what they can negotiate most smoothly, most immediately. But we'll know more after this weekend in this big meeting in the exciting venue of rural Western Canada.
Right, for sure. Stephen, you mentioned President Lee Jae-myung's phone conversation with Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba earlier on this Monday. Now, the two leaders are expected to meet on the sidelines of the G7 summit in Canada. What issues do you suppose might their talks cover?
I think they'll probably say things like future-oriented a lot, and they'll probably say things like, in short, they'll probably try to focus on what they have in common and try to leave the more divisive matters off the agenda. I mean, I read the press release that Lee's office put out today, and I was a little bit surprised at just how very early in his term Lee has been quite decisively positive about the question of trilateral cooperation with Japan and the U.S. Lee is a longtime member of South Korea's progressive camp, and they've customarily been, at least in terms of their rhetoric, they've been kind of suspicious of that. They have argued that they didn't want South Korea to get pulled into trilateral cooperation until they had what they felt like was a more decisive or a more satisfying resolution to the historical issues with Japan. So it's interesting to me, at least a little bit, that this early in his term, Lee is not mentioning those historical matters. He's not saying that cooperation with Japan will be contingent upon any like stronger or more final show of contrition from Tokyo as some previous left-wing leaders have. So I think this could be, today's phone conversation and then whatever contact they have at the G7 summit could be a kind of positive start out of the gates. But once it gets to the potential of a proper summit, when it comes to the question of like, is Lee going to travel to Japan or is Ishiba going to travel to Seoul? That gets a lot thornier, because that's when the two sides have to kind of agree on an agenda in advance, and they, in a format like that, they would at least need to have some kind of discussion of the historical matters. So this is, I think you could take this as a kind of positive start, but it doesn't mean anything really concrete just yet.
Right, and speaking about positive starts, Fabian, as Stephen mentioned, President Lee Jae-myung spoke with his U.S. counterpart Donald Trump last Friday. He's also poised to meet with Trump on the sidelines of the G7 summit in Canada. Could you tell us a bit about the conversation last Friday and perhaps about the issues that they might discuss in Canada?
Yeah, I think they had a rather positive start. Actually, during their first phone call, they also talked about golf. I mean, that is some small talk, but I mean, in all seriousness, this is important that they, get the chemistry going, because that's how Trump works. I think he's not a conventional president, and he bases his decision also whether he likes someone, respects someone. And to be honest, I think that Lee Jae-myung has good chances of being likable for Trump, because Trump sees himself as anti-elitist and a man from the people. Lee Jae-myung certainly is. And while Lee Jae-myung has been quite critical in the past towards like the US establishment, I would say Trump also is. And I think I see that this relationship could be working and could be going in a good direction. But yeah, to the main issues, that is of course the tariffs, and that was also the main topic of agenda during the phone call. And both sides basically said that they want to achieve tangible results soon. that is, yeah, good rhetoric, but who knows, in the end, we only know when we have a deal what the exact results are. And also in future meetings with Trump, tariffs will be the #1 topic. If you look at the current state of South Korean economy, it's not going so well. In the first quarter, GDP was actually surprisingly shrinking. And of course, when tariffs also will hit South Korea, that will be over proportionally because South Korea is depending on exports. So that is the main issue. Secondly, I would say that the security issue is very important for South Korea. Trump has repeatedly threatened to pull off US soldiers here in South Korea, or has threatened South Korea to pay more money for US security. I think that will be an issue that both presidents will discuss, and let's see how it goes. But I would say the first start was good.
Right. And speaking about security, Stephen, speaking at the annual Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore roughly about a week ago, U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, he warned against the pursuit of security with the U.S. and trade with China, which essentially is a strategy for South Korea. Do you suppose at one point in the future South Korea is going to be forced to choose sides between the U.S. and China?
Well, I feel like this is a kind of a question that's beyond my qualifications to provide a really decisive answer to, but I would say that I would just point to what I think is kind of like an unfortunate reality for Korea, that like that question will not be entirely up to the government here. Like that's going to depend on how the governments in Washington and Beijing choose to deal with Korea. So I spoke to an expert last week when I was reporting a story who gave me a line that's been sticking in my head, and he said that Lee is going to have to always bear in mind that when he's interacting with either the US or China, that he does not have transactional leverage. It's just like a much smaller economy here. When Lee is talking to Trump, he's going to have to be bearing in mind the entire time that what his main goal has to be is getting access for South Korean companies to the US consumer market, which is the biggest in the world, and which a lot of Korean companies really rely on. And it's a more complicated relationship, but it's a kind of similar thing with China. China has been a major destination for South Korean exports for a very long time. They're different exports. These are the semiconductors, and to the US, it's autos and it's appliances and all things like that. Like, that's what Lee is going to be trying to achieve, and his counterparts in both of those countries are going to be very well aware of that. And both the leaders in both of those countries are not, neither of them are like huge fans of the idea of multilateralism. Both of them are, kind of strong-headed guys who want to feel as though they are taking a decisive lead in world affairs, and they want to know if other countries are on their side or on the other side. So it's going to be a really difficult question for how Lee chooses to play this. I mean, what I imagine he's talking about with his team right now is, since he lacks this so-called transactional leverage, he's got to think, well, what does he have in his quiver? I mean, and the kind of obvious thing is that South Korea applies a very strategic place on the world map. This is a country that borders North Korea, is right near some very key shipping lanes. This country hosts a very large U.S. military presence and provides a very strategic vantage point for the U.S. goal of containing China. So there's a lot going on, and I think we will have more insight into this soon, but there's a lot of moving parts, and I think Lee at some point is going to have to decide what he ultimately feels is most important, and he'll probably do what most politicians do, and he'll probably try to please as many people as he can, to the point where none of them get too upset and all of them feel as though their interests are satisfied to a kind of modicum basis, but not going too all in on, not solving the issue of companies that need ties with China very desperately and companies that need ties with the US very desperately, trying to balance the interests of a fairly big country of more than 50 million people with an export-led economy. Lee wanted this job, and now he has it, and now he's got to deal with all the complexity of it. So.
Right, complexity to say the least. Fabian, with regard to tensions here on the Korean Peninsula then, do you envision a tangible de-escalation on the Korean Peninsula under the Lee Jae-myung administration?
Well, at least the new government here is trying hard to de-escalate. Just today, for example, when there was a leaflet sending, like an NGO was sending leaflets over to the border to North Korea, the reaction by the South Korean government was that it this was regrettable because it would escalate tensions. And that is quite a big change of position compared to conservative former President Yoon Suk-yeol, who at some point in some speeches was pushing for the idea to get outside information to the North Korean people. Now I think the new government really wants to tone down anything that could be seen as provocative. However, I mean, to de-escalate, both sides have to dance the tango. And does North Korea want to de-escalate? There's one very prestigious North Korea expert called Arirang, and before the election he said that, well, North Korea would probably slightly prefer a democratic government led by the DP instead of a conservative government in South Korea, but in the end they don't care that much. And how they view the new government is more like a big ATM, like a cash machine. That is a little bit of a cynical view, but I think North Korea sees some opportunities. Maybe if we give some concessions, then we will get also some financial means. Of course, there are sanctions, so the opportunities, what can be done is limited. But in the end, I share actually Lenkov's view. North Korea has changed. It has become quite hostile and has less incentives to engage with the world. And in the end, it's not South Korea that prevents any exchange, also human-to-human or cultural exchange. It is the North Korean regime which really isolates its people. And I think that is something we really have to see very clearly, and we should not be naive about it. And I hope that the new government here in South Korea will also not be naive about it.
Right. Do you suppose that their decision not to engage with South Korea is also based on the fact that they have a military pact with Russia?
Exactly. That is, they're in a very convenient position, in a very sweet spot, and right now they don't depend on engaging with South Korea, and also they don't really depend on engaging with the US anymore.
Right. Well, we'll be talking more about North Korea, what South Korea's policy on North Korea on Wednesday. For now, Fabian, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. And Stephen, as always, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
All right. On that note, we say goodbye for today, and we return same time tomorrow with more panel discussion.